Welcome, everyone, to this book launch of a new, very exciting book by Noemi Pérez Vásquez, who joins us, and I will tell you a little bit more about her in a minute. But before I get to anything, I would like to welcome you all to the lands from which I'm speaking, which is the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, over which sovereignty has never been ceded. And many of us today may be meeting or maybe connecting from unceded indigenous lands. So it's important to acknowledge that sovereignty over the lands where we sit is contested, and the colonial project is unfortunately alive and kicking. And we can always hope that not for too much longer. So today we come together under the auspices of the Australian Human Rights Institute to talk about Noemi Pérez Vásquez's new book on women's access to transitional justice in Timor-Leste, The Blind Letters, which came out in June of this year. Noemi is joining us from the United Kingdom. Thank you so much for waking up early for this. And I look forward to our conversation. She currently works for the United Nations in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. She has also in the past worked for other branches of the UN, such as the UN Development Program and the United Nations Children's Fund, the UNICEF, and also the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. She spent some time in East Timor, Timor-Leste, at the Universidade Nacional Timor Lorosa'e in Dili, Timor-Leste, which was the base from which she did the field work that essentially is in this book. She has lived in, as any self-respecting UN career person, she has lived in many countries. She speaks a wealth of languages. She's very exciting, and she has many stories to tell us. But today, most of the stories she will tell us are about her experiences in Timor-Leste and the stories that she has heard, right? So she's going to retell us some of those stories and her analysis from the perspective of transitional justice and gender. So this event is being recorded. So if anyone has any issues with that, you may want to keep your interventions to the chat and Q&A if you want to speak live. But please do feel free to put questions even as we go, and then we're going to do the Q&A at the end. So the way we're going to proceed with this is that Noemi is going to tell us about the book and what the book does and its intervention for the next 25-30 minutes, and then we're just going to have a conversation about it. So Noemi, thanks again for joining us, for agreeing to do this event, and take it away.
Thank you, Lucas. Thank you very much to you and to the Australia Human Rights Institute for organizing this and giving me the opportunity to present my new book, as you mentioned. So I'm going to start with a story, and then I'm going to explain you what I did on this research that took me 6 years. So during the interviews with women, I used to ask each of the women if they knew how to write and read in order to know their level of in their society, what is called intersectionality and gender. And Anand Kasia, a famous veteran in Lixinski village, she told me that, yes, I went to the School of Blind Letters, because the name of the book is Women's Access to Justice, to Transitional Justice in Timor-Leste, The Blind Letters. And she said, yes, I went to the School of Blind Letters. And I thought, and my research assistant, the Timorese, was like, what does she mean? And basically she meant that the school was there, but she could not get access to the school. So she didn't know how to read and write. And I thought that was a beautiful metaphor in order to explain that sometimes also justice may be there, but is not going to be accessible to all. So what I did on the book, or what what was my research about was how come cases of widespread and systematic violations that were committed against women, they were not taken into consideration like the different transitional justice mechanisms that were implemented in the country. What I did was to actually uncover women's stories and to show the higher threshold to have for them to have access to the different transitional justice mechanisms that were available. And I show also how in many occasions women's violations were committed because of their condition as women, but also how a justice system that should be blinded. And I use a lot of metaphors in the book about blindness and memory, silence, narrative. And in reality may perpetuate women's silence and discrimination, since we may not be taking into consideration the public and private divides that exist in a local context, nor the values and stereotypes of both local and international actors that have a role in transitional justice. So in this presentation, I want to first talk about the history of Timor-Leste. For those of you, although maybe Australians, they know more about Timor-Leste. The second one, I want to talk about how the different transitional justice evolve, and I want to share the findings of my research and what I did in the book, and I want to conclude with the arguments. So you may know in Australia that Timor-Leste used to be, for instance, a Portuguese colony until 1974, when there was the fall of the regime of Salazar. Then in Timor, they kind of they started discussing what was going to be the future, and there were several groups. One was supporting the independence, radical independence. Others were supporting the gradual independence from Indonesia. Others they were supporting to be part of the independence from Portugal. Others were supporting go and be part of Indonesia. So there were several voices, and then there was a civil war of Timorese. And then in that civil war, Indonesia decided to intervene. So Indonesia, from December 1975 until September 1999, Timor-Leste was under the control of Indonesia. Then grave violations of human rights were committed all around along these years. And in 1999, the United Nations, it was decided to organize a political referendum in Timor-Leste in order to ask the Timorese if they wanted to be part of Indonesia or if they wanted to be an independent nation. So almost 80 people, they voted that they wanted to be independent. And what's happened was that the Indonesian government at that time had armed militias group, and then when the results of the elections came out, then there was an escalation of the crisis and of the violence. So people who were supporters of independence, they were targeted. And according to for instance, and people like almost the whole country was burned out, all the infrastructure. And according to the True Commission after, they found that more than 11,000 allegations of torture and 769 allegations of sexual violence against women were committed, including sexual slavery between 1974 and 1999. So there were violations committed between 75 until 99, from 75 to 1999. And then in 1999, there was a race in the violence that was committed after the elections results. And then the United Nations, they decided to intervene with under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, and they established a UN administration in Timor-Leste with Sergio Vieira de Melo, who was a famous Brazilian diplomat of the organization, and who was supposed to be, he was a good candidate to become a Secretary General of the United Nations, but he was killed in Iraq. So the United Nations, it was the government, and the UN, they started then to promulgate and laws, regulations, and they also set up the mechanism for the investigation, prosecution, and trial of individuals suspected of serious violations of international law. The exclusive power, it lasted until 2002, when there were new elections of Timorese people and the power was transferred to the Timorese, right? A Timorese government was elected. So basically from 1999 to 2002, the government was the United Nations. It was a UN administration. So why I'm coming actually from Latin America, and the reason why I chose Timor-Leste is because of the role. There are several reasons, including the role of the international community in the design and implementation of the transitional justice mechanisms. In Timor-Leste, the UN was in charge of the trials. They also had a role supporting the True Commission, which was a Timorese initiative, but they were on their back. They also had a role in the drafting of the reparations law. But also, as I said, the level of power that it is only comparable with Kosovo, for instance, as a government. But also, Timor-Leste was very interesting because of the wide variety of justice mechanisms that were implemented. No? There was, for instance, a UN Commission of Inquiry, a Special Indonesian Investigative Commission, a Serious Crimes Unit, and a special panel for serious crimes. These were the trials. There was also an Indonesian ad hoc human rights court for East Timor, a commission of experts of the UN. There was a True Commission in Timor-Leste. There was also another True Commission and Friendship Commission with Indonesia. So you have a wide variety of transitional justice mechanisms, and for me that was very interesting to see, you know, the wide variety and how women interacted with all of them, right? And also, it is a relative recent case which allowed me to interview the participants of what happened, and to see, when I did the interviews was 2016, and this mechanism, they ended like in around 2005. So it was interesting to see what happened years after, no? And to interview the people who had a role. So I lived there from 2016 to 2017. I traveled all around the country doing all these interviews. In total, there were 123 people that I interviewed, which is a lot. 77 women in several villages who were victims of crimes and grave violations of human rights. And the rest of the people that I interviewed, the 46, they were policymakers, UN and NGO employees, politicians. They had a role in the trials, in the commission in the True Commission, in the reparations, etc., etc. But besides the interviews, I also spent 6 months at the Dili District Court, where the files of the special panels are located. And what I wanted to do was a feminist legal revision of the cases. In this book, what I tried to do was to, based on what women told me, then to understand how was the implementation of the laws regarding transitional justice, but also the policy making, how were they implemented, but also, which was very important in my research, how also the family and the communities, they had a role in the mechanisms of transitional justice. So I wanted to follow the cascade of transitional justice, and to see, like, when you are in a village, right, and you start receiving cards of the United Nations, or, you know, big cards that you have never seen, how do you experience justice after a conflict, right? What do you receive as a victim? How do you interact with these mechanisms? Besides Timor, so the book is about Timor-Leste, but I also included, because I'm from Latin America, and also at my university, so as University of London, I had the opportunity to be teaching as a research assistant the master course on African politics, and the master course on transitional justice. So I also brought experiences of other jurisdictions of African countries, what happened in Yugoslavia, Latin American countries, to show the larger trends regarding the structural barriers that women face, and the logic behind their socio-economic exclusion in peacetime. You will see that in this book, I talk a lot about socio-economic exclusion. So what did I find in my research? So first, when I was interviewing the women, I noticed that although, for instance, I was talking to sexual slaves or the people that were into forced marriage or crimes, grave violations of human rights, and I told you that many of these mechanisms, they ended in 2005. I observed that the majority of the women that I interviewed, they never shared their stories of what happened to them until 2012 onwards. So this meant that cases concerning serious human rights violations against women were never dealt by transitional justice, which was strange. For instance, one woman told me how, like, she was in a church, an NGO went and asked who were tortured in the local hotel, and she raised her hand. And when I was doing the interview with her, she said that basically she was picked up every night by the battalion, taken to this hotel, and she was tortured, gun raped every night. When I asked her what was the frequency, she said every day, every night, and this was for 20 years. She had 5 children from different fathers, and she basically she had been tortured, right? And when I asked her how do you interact with transitional justice, she said that some people went to her house after the conflict and asked her if somebody had been killed, and she said no. And then they left. And when I asked her why you didn't say what happened to you, she said, because I was not asked this question. So that was very, for me, revealing about how do we access victims in a post-conflict situation. But I also saw that these women, they had a tendency to ask for an apology today for the violations that they suffered, and they talk about the lack of recognition of these violations and they talk also about their participation during the Indonesian occupation, and they make a connection. My book, and I want to emphasize this, it has a connection with socioeconomic justice. And I finding that of my research is that women today in Timor-Leste, they do an association. When we talk about post-conflict justice, they do an association with the veterans pension. So when you ask them what is important, what is transitional justice or what is justice for you, they said, I don't care about the trial, the true commission, they came and nothing came after, I share and nothing came afterwards. But what happened to me, I was not recognizing the veterans pension. And I included the veterans pension, the welfare, as part of the transition. I say that this should be taken into account as part of the transitional justice mechanism, and how it is so, which it should be a concern that we have not been taking into consideration these welfare structures in the post-conflict justice literature. So now I will go to proceed, because what I tried to do was, we have different packages of transitional justice, and how come they are blind to the women's violations, And I explain the barriers, and I kind of argue how it is like a shopping list. The women, they try to interact with each of them, and then they pass from one to another one, and that's how the end to going into the one of providing the pensions today. So, for instance, for the pensions, there were several reasons why women's violations were excluded, and this is what I tried to uncover. You must know that when the United Nations, they did the regulation, they said that, okay, in the regulation, we are going to explore genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, the usual, during and before 1999, as well as murder, sexual offenses, and torture only in 1999. And here are 2 elements that had an impact on women, because in practice what they did was only to focus on the 1999 escalation of the conflict. So they didn't, because usually in the trials of after a conflict, the prosecution, they have to prioritize and they do like an escalation, what should be the crime that we are going to prosecute. And what they did was not to explore all, although in the regulation was, we are going to see what was committed from 1975, they only in practice focus on 1999. So this means that women who were, for instance, sexual slave for 20 years, these cases they didn't enter. But then they also did a separation, as I said, between genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and murder, sexual offenses, and torture. And these three, murder, sexual offenses, and torture, the problem was that they were taken out of, they were going to be considered like outside of the conflict, without a conflict logic, no? And this also affected the cases concerning women. And then, as I said, that the prosecution, they identified 10 priority cases. But the majority, there were 202 accused, but 183 were at large in Indonesia, so they could not be prosecuted. And the focus then of the prosecution was to focus on killing and massacres. And the problem is that how women explain to me, when you have a conflict, actually, the crimes, they tend to be very gender. So the women even explained to me, men used to be killed, and men to be they suffer from summary execution and torture. But women, we used to be targeted sexually, or we used to be, for instance, detained, no? Because in Timor, what happened during all those years is that the men went to the mountains and the women stayed in the villages. So if the men were doing they targeted Indonesians, the Indonesians were taking reprisals against the women. And then, or the women, for instance, they talk a lot about forced displacement, how they were moved, people from hot lands, they were taken to cold lands, and people from cold lands were taken, and how this was difficult for them to survive because they didn't know the environment, how to do their agricultural, so how violations are very gender, no? But the persecutions, and this is usually in transitional justice, that killing, it is the violation that has the biggest focus, no? And this has an effect on the recognitions of crimes committed against women. They didn't count with a gender expert in the beginning, and also all the reports, they do not mention forensic experts and medical professionals in dealing with cases of sexual violence. But also what happened was that during the procedure, during the legal process, the defense used also, for instance, the consent by the defense. Victims, they were asked about the same crimes, for instance, of sexual violence all over again. But also when I was reading the cases, something that it was very surprising for me is how private, the private matters. For instance, you had cases where the woman, they were saying how they were raped in a room, they were going out to the living room after the Indonesian left, and all the family were saying like, stay quiet, nothing happened, no? And they were saying this in the tribunal. But also how they were saying how they didn't want to participate at the tribunals because these were very intimidating process for her. What about if they prove me wrong, right? So why? I will talk to some foreigners, in a courtroom and all over again. It's maybe better just to stay out of that. What was the results of the trials is that although I told you that there was widespread and systematic violations committed against women, especially sexual violence, there was only one event, only one case, because the cases, they have several violations and several crimes. There was only one case, the Lolotoe case, that included an event on a rape as a crime against humanity. So only one particular event of 3 women. And only, as I told you, because the large of the population they were in Indonesia, so only a handful of people were ever prosecuted. But in 2005, even for those prosecuted, the Timorese government decided to go like in a reconciliation process, and they started giving pardons to everyone. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you have to understand that so they did a report called Shega in 2005, enough. And the conclusion was that Indonesians, they committed widespread and systematic violations against the Timorese population. But when I was interviewing the women, from 77, only 19 participated. And as I told you, they had horrendous stories of what happened to them. And then I discovered that when you go back, you see that only between 1 and 2% of the population, of Timorese population, participated in the Truth Commission. I discovered that not everybody managed to talk in those public hearings. Why? Because it was difficult to engage with rural women. There was also a resistance to women's participation in public activities, the reliance also of the staff of the Truth Commission for the opponents' statements to identify other victims. So they have to identify people that they were going to identify the victims. Men were the heads of the households, but even personal hesitations of the women to come forward, right? But I also found that when women, they were telling me their violations, they were many of them were teenagers when they were targeted by the Indonesians. How the village chief, they had a role, for instance, because one question that I have for them was like, but how come if you were targeted by this battalion and then the battalion moved and then another battalion came, how come you were still targeted? And then they explained to me, no, it's because the village chief was the one telling them, this is a woman that you can target, no? And I thought that was very interesting, the local participation of the people in the facilitation of the crimes, right? These are not people that they are not considered to be pro-Indonesians, but because they were scared or they facilitated women's violations. That's a fact. And these people, or for instance, I had another case in the village of the cover of the woman on the cover. They told me, several of these women, they told me that how when they were 15 years old, they had to go to the house of the village chief at night, and then they were picked up by the Indonesians, taken to the battalion, and then they were brought back in the morning, no? And it was always at the house of the village chief. And the village chief, they were the people that were in charge of choosing who was going to talk afterwards. And obviously, if violations are committed against them, imagine that then you are in charge. You have to rely on local people, but we really don't know who are these local people. And maybe the local people, they have their own interests as well. But also many women told me that they participated in the Truth Commission because they were looking for information. They said like, oh yeah, of course, we saw cars coming to the village. We wanted to go and see what was going on, if there was going to be any help. Or they just participated out of curiosity. And for me, I talk a lot about, for instance, indicators, no? Because today, maybe the participation, if you have a big group of people in those audiences, public hearings, you may say, oh, it was very successful, but the fact that these people are there does not mean that they share what we are doing in these public hearings, right? And this is a little bit like the lie of the use of how we are using indicators and measuring success. But many women told me that, so in 2005, when they published the report, the government, again, they said, this is not possible to implement this, let's put this aside. And then the women told me that how after being called and that they had to share their stories, they were called the victims in the village, and how even today when they walk around in the villages, people are like, here comes the victim. How they were labeled after participation at the Truth Commission. And I argue in the book is that because there was no any closure, can you imagine the responsibility to ask these people to say what happened to them, and then there is no any closure by the state. These women, they just stay with a label. Because it's not the same to be, I interview men, especially politicians, that they say very proudly, I was tortured, because of the resistance. So I am a big, brave man. Then I am a victim, or I am a rape victim. No, the society sees you different. For the reparations, I must say that basically what I did on the book was to go mechanism by mechanism to show how there was a total lack of reparations for the victims from all the institutions. For instance, the special panels created by the UN, they had a compensation fund for the victims in the regulation. This was never implemented. But also you have cases of, in 1999, the UN, you had like 11 people who were killed. They were working for the UN, they were assisting during the referendum. And out of them, the 11, 12 people, one woman, she was killed. All the men, they received compensation by the UN fund. And the woman, the family, they have to appeal the case because it was mentioned, or what the rumor was, that she was not killed because of her labor during the independence, because of her work, but she was killed because of a passionate relationship with a militiaman. And so you have all these stories coming up, and the family, they have to struggle. And it was thanks also to local UN employees in Timor-Leste who for them this was absurd, and they have to help the family to appeal in headquarters, no? But also the True Commission, they had a immediate help to assist the people, and it was $200, no? But it was only given to 712 people, and out of 712 people, only 196, they were women. When I asked the person in charge of this, why is that disparity? And he said, no, men were the mostly affected. And what I argue in the book is that violations against women, they might also be invisible. You know, as I said, for instance, men torture, they are, you know, people say it, but if you were raped, actually the family will ask you to stay quiet, because especially in some societies, there is also an economic, there might be also an economic survival reason. If you have fertility, you need to get married, and you know, you depend on all these associations in the community. So people, they may have some reason to stay quiet. But I also talk about how what happened was that after the True Commission, in this report, they did a list of recommendations, and as I said, the government, they didn't want to implement it. And then there was a draft law on reparations. And what I found out during the interviews is that I talked, for instance, to the politician that she was in charge of this draft, the law, and she said that in the beginning, many politicians were supporting, but afterwards, they were actually kind of saying, no, it's not better, let's put this on the drawer. They were against the idea of providing reparations to the victims. And one point that I was raised to me several times is that politicians, because the politicians in Timor-Leste used to be the members of the resistance, they thought that by drafting or approving a law on reparations, violations committed also by the Timorese, they were going to go to the surface. And that because all the victims, they were going to claim something. And they thought that this was going to affect their stability in power. And this has happened in other countries as well. I found out afterwards, like Nepal and other countries, like or Lebanon as well, you know, that they prefer to remain quiet about the violations committed also from their part, and they kind of put some makeup like a big bubble of what happened in the past. So there is no really personal accountability about the individuals, about the crimes that were committed against them. So at the end, no reparations were provided for Timorese women and for the Timorese population. But in the book, because the book also has a post-colonial element, I said that what I found out, you know, that there are different types of reparations, right? Restitution, rehabilitation, compensation, and satisfaction, no repetition, measures of no, guarantees of no repetition. And I mentioned that there is an over-focus on compensation today. It might be because of the reparation is equal to money, no? And I say that this has been very harmful for the victims and for the psyche. Why? Because I recognize that Timorese leaders, they have some reasons to say we cannot give money to everybody, right? In a country after a conflict. Because resources are limited, we need to look for development. We need to think about economic growth. No, there is no money. No, and in the human rights discourse, compensation has been the easiest way, but also the most difficult to provide reparations for victims. And when I found out, it is that victims, they might be wanting to have, a job or rehabilitation or just a recognition of what, as I told you in the beginning, how they ask for an apology for what happened to them. There is also a risk. There is also the satisfaction of the state. They look for a recognition of the state, saying that what happened to them, it was not really their fault. So I talk about this disparity, and I talk, for instance, how this might be the influence of European countries in the legal system. And Lucas, you may remember Cansado Trinidad, who was a judge of the International Court of Justice, and also he was in the Inter-American system. And I remember once in a classroom, he was saying like how, because for instance, in the Inter-American system, they have that tension about compensation and alternative ways of reparation. And he said in a classroom, I remember, how in the Inter-American system, because the states they have limited resources, they cannot ask the state to give money to all the victims when crimes happen. And he said how at the Inter-American system, actually they look for creative ways to recognize the victims, but also to help the communities. And he said, for instance, in a Central American case, how there were some youth killed, and then they ordered the state to create a hospital and to call the hospital with the name of the boys killed. So in a way, how we help the community with scarce resources, but also recognizing the victims. And I think this is the way forward. Why? Because Timor-Leste, the Timorese politicians, they asked me, but why, for instance, if Germany, they killed the Jews during the Second World War, but why Germany pay Israel? Why if the Indonesians kill us, why do we need to pay for the crimes committed by the Indonesians? And the problem is that in international human rights law, reparations is an obligation of the state, so it should be from Timor-Leste, no? And I think what I wanted to do with the post-colonial approach is that to argue that maybe we should look at reparations for victims in a transnational way. For instance, the responsibility of the US, the responsibility of Australia as well in the Timorese conflict. So instead of the country that is getting out of the conflict that doesn't have any resources, they shouldn't be labeled by the UN system and by the international community as the ones responsible to pay for the reparations to the victims, no? They had a point regarding this. So because the women, they didn't have anywhere where to go, they actually have now a tendency to go to the veterans pension. Why? Because the veterans pension, and I argue that what we are seeing in different conflicts in the world is that the money doesn't go to the reparations. The reparations stay in the laws, but the money goes to the demobilized, and the money goes to the veterans of a conflict, right? Demobilized, then if they won, they will become the veterans. So women are like, why if my neighbor, he was in the mountain and nothing happened to him, and I was cooking for the resistance, and I was targeted, why do they receive $230 per month and I don't have anything? And then when I talk to the politicians, they say, oh no, but women, they can go to the mother sports, like the Brazilian mother sports, Bolsa da Mãe. The difference is that the Bolsa da Mãe mother sports program for women is $4 per month. And the minimum that you can get in the veterans pension is $230 per month. From $4 to $230 minimum, because it can go up to $575. No, and special people can go up to $750. So there is a disparity there. And this is creating an intergenerational impact, because they think these women, they think about their children, and you see the comparison about the children of the others versus the children of their own women. They are like, why are we having this disparity today if I was ordered to do this? And when I argue, transitional justice doesn't take into account pensions for veterans. I argue that we should take into account these welfare structures that are created, because these are the mechanisms that have the biggest impact in the long term after a conflict. The same is happening in other countries as well, for instance, Rwanda. But women are deliberately and this excluded, and this mechanism is highly discriminatory against women. Why? Very quickly, because division of labor. For instance, women, it was not that women were not doing anything during the conflict, but as I said, the activities were very gender, and men used to go to the jungle, women stay there, and they were working as in the clandestine movement. They were ordered to cook for the resistance, collect money, provide goods. But then they were targeted because of that. For instance, a woman, she was porting something, and then the Indonesians discovered, then she was sexually assaulted years and years. So the work of the women, it was not valued. It was devalued afterwards. But also they said, oh, we are going to take into account only exclusive dedication. And women, because they were in the village, they were doing clandestine, and they were doing both. So these were excluded. But also they said, we are going to separate, men were tortured, women were targeted sexual violence. Sexual violence is not considered in the law. And this is a mistake, because sexual violence can be committed as part of torture, right? But also they said, oh, we are going to take into account prolonged detention. But as I told you before, many of these women, they were detained during the nights, right? 20 years, every night they were detained and tortured, and they were sexually assaulted. These women, they were excluded. But also women, for instance, if your husband was killed and you got the pension, if you remarried, they were going to take the pension out of you. But also they depend on the decisions they were taking to consider. They were getting support from the local committees. And the local committees, they were saying, no, you didn't get a gun, get out of the queue. A woman told me that this happened to her and that she felt so ashamed. And obviously, there was intersectionality, access to information, literacy. People in the city, they got quicker the access to the veterans pension. How the information, moved. People were like, yeah, you should apply. Don't tell anybody. So the first one that were connected were the first one to get the veterans pension. And they told me corruption practices also was very common. So, for instance, how they told me, depending on who you knew in the top, you were going to get your veterans pension. So all this, what I try to show you is how all these barriers, they affected women's access to justice after the conflict. So just to conclude, I have two big arguments. One is that without unpacking the barriers in the administration of transitional justice, the different mechanisms implemented in a post-conflict situation may set higher thresholds, meaning layers, barriers that limit women's participation and recognition of their experiences. But the second argument that I argue in the book is that by engaging with different concepts of justice, not only criminal justice, but as I said, socio-economic justice, I argue that we should consider women's opinion concerning the justice received, and how scholars we have paid insufficient attention to the welfare structures that are created after a conflict, particularly the pensions for veterans. So women's perception of both justice and contribution during a conflict are excluded, neglecting the fact that a relationship between violations and post-economic justice may have long-term consequences for women, since this perpetuates their silence, inequality, and lack of recognition in the aftermath of a conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. This was tremendous and so very sad and powerful at the same time. everyone, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box that you have in front of you. In the meantime, while you think about it, I just want to kick off with two questions. One is a very Timor-Leste specific question, which is, did these women ever get a chance to exercise agency? Because right now, the stories you told us, it's just one after the other, right? Women are rendered invisible, they're rendered victims, they're rendered passive. Did they ever manage to break through in any circumstance? Is there a quote unquote happy story in the bunch? And I know that, and the quotes is because, it's still transitional justice. It's still in the aftermath of very violent tragedy to which Australia has contributed in more ways than it likes to acknowledge. So that's question one, whether and how these women ever got to exercise agency in these processes. And the second question is a question about the broader intervention to how we think about transitional justice. So I just wanted to, and it was there somewhere in the talk, but I want to tease you out. I want to urge you to tease out a bit more clearly. What does the example and the experience of these women in Timor-Leste teach us about how transitional justice works or should think of itself?
Sure. Should I answer these two questions first, or? Yeah, okay, great. So about the first question, did these women have an agency about in the whole situation? Definitely. And I was in another book launch yesterday night, and I was saying how these women are very clever women. Somebody asked me about the pensions for veterans. And I said that something that they go to the veterans pension as well because they see that, as I said, tribunals, this was for, big people, big fish, they said. Through commissions, yes, these people came and they took our stories, nothing happened afterwards. There was no any help. Reparations, there were no reparations. So they very cleverly, they go to the veterans pension, and that's where they try to fit in, They associate their violations to the veterans pensions. That's something that us scholars, we haven't thought about it, first. But also, those women that got the veterans pension, because they were asking me yesterday, a student, she was asking me how does this work? I explained that it was a monthly amount, depending on how many years they participated and so on, and if the women were receiving this. And I said that in many cases, the women, they try to fake that they pass away. Why? Because they thought that, and this is agency. They thought that, no, let's put the child as the beneficiary of the veteran pension. Why? Because the child is going to last longer than the woman. So this is also how they, and somebody was asking me if there was a difference for me coming from the South, doing research in another country from the South. And I said that maybe because the country that I'm coming from, that basically I'm coming from Venezuela, and we have a society that, the Venezuelans, they try to, how can I put this, but you try to, how can you get all this help from the state, all the assistance and the welfare different programs, and you became very savvy, in trying to getting access to this financial assistance provided by the state. And for me, when they were explaining that to me, it makes total sense that this is a very clever move of the women thinking about the welfare of the family in the long term. So I think what I'm trying to say is that in a way, they, in their scarcity of resources, they try to practice. They have agency in their decisions as well. I also say that because, as I said, in the veterans, they were recognized in the for the veterans pension after the conflict, but also victims, there was an escalation of violence, and you may remember that even Ramos Horta was the president, he was shot in 2006 between the people from the east and the west in Timor-Leste. And those victims, they received reparations from 2006. So basically, I say that today is women, exercising their agency, seeing how come these people, veterans who were in the mountains or that they suffer all this, or they receive, this assistance, how come these victims, they receive this assistance? Where are we today? And I say that it might be possible. It might be possible that victims, they also start talking about their violations after years, in 2012, because they see the differences of access to justice, access to help from the state, from other groups. So this is a way of, of being, okay, this is what happened to me. I also deserve a recognition and a help from the state. Regarding the broader intervention of transitional justice, I think in the book, what I try to say is that we should take into consideration socioeconomic justice as well, because especially in a country coming out of the conflict, people, they want to survive. And as the women told me, tribunals is something very far away. They are more focused on their daily life. And there is a tendency of the international community, for instance, to put their very high standards on trials, right? On tribunals. But at the same time, these people are totally forgotten, no? Something that I haven't mentioned in my presentation is that in the book, I talk about all the barriers that women face and how they were doing a kind of a shopping from one mechanism to jump into another one until trying to get access to the veterans pension. But I have a chapter that talks about memory and silence, no? And how transitional justice have a role in the shaping of the memory of the nation. And I say how, for instance, the youth today in Timor-Leste, they depend on the narrative that the politicians, they give to the youth. And that's why, for instance, if you see all the memorials, and you will find this interesting, Lucas, if you see all the memorials in Timor-Leste, usually are men with large guns, no? And you see this in many other processes, for instance, many African countries, etc., etc. So it is a very prototype of armed men, which is what is respected today, and which is what, in the psyche of the state, it is considered that the country should be thankful to these men. While in reality, during the conflict, you have different fronts. As I said, you had the diplomatic front with Ramos Horta, you had the clandestine front, that the majority of were women composing this clandestine front, because they have a dual capacity during the resistance, and you have the armed men, the armed front that were the men in the mountains. So, but it's very interesting how the narrative also move, throughout the years, and how also the politicians, they have a role in the shaping of the history of a nation. To the point that, for instance, my research assistant who did gender studies, he got a scholarship, he did gender studies in Hawaii, or my flatmate in Timor, who was at Timor, is working for UN Women. They never heard about these stories about these women. So the majority of the population in Timor-Leste is youth, and they do not know anything about what happened in the conflict, except that the conflict, and we are talking about conflict that just ended in 1999. And the information that they get is that, oh yeah, these are the men that help us to get the resistance, but nothing else happened. They do not dig into it, and they do not know the different experiences of women. So about the broader intervention of transitional justice, I think it is very important to think about what's the role of transitional justice in the creation of narrative and memory of a nation, because this is related to guarantees of non-repetition, right? But also, I argue in the book that it is very important to create these processes and these mechanisms, but also to establish mechanisms of correction. Because what we have a tendency, and David Kennedy have written about this, is that sometimes the institutions, they keep the mistakes within doors, and they do not want to share what's happening and the flaws of the mechanisms. And this is a mistake that we commit all over and over again. And what I show in the book is how stereotypes of international and locals, they all also interfere and they affect the development of transitional justice mechanisms to the point that they exclude people and that they are discriminated against certain groups in the society.
Thank you. Maya asks, and I think that's a great note to end on. What's next? What's your next book or project? And will you continue to work on justice issues in Timor-Leste?
So now I'm working for the UN as a legal advisor in Colombia. So I'm now working more in the use of force. We are doing a massive project on security reform doctrine with the Ministry of Defense, police, military, etc., etc. So thanks God I'm working in an exciting project. But I also, after the PhD, I realized how important is reproductive rights in post-conflict justice. And this is a topic that hasn't been taken into consideration sufficiently. And it is only until 2 years or 3 years ago that we are talking more about reproductive rights. Why? Because women during a conflict, they are targeted, right? And for instance, a woman told me a woman that was in sexual slavery, how they make her abort 5 times, and how her main concern after the end of the conflict was to be able to have a child on her own. She told me, I didn't care with whom, I really want to be a mother, because I didn't want to be alone in this world. And for me, or another woman who told me that she was 12 years old and she was gang raped for 2 consecutive days. And she said how, all her organs, she was blue, bleeding and so on. And for me, it was like, how come after a justice, after the end of a conflict, we are not looking into the rehabilitation, and health facilities for these women and the consequences of these women? There's nothing in post-conflict justice about that. So I have been written some articles about how, for instance, there was a lack of reparations for these violations in Timor-Leste, and how there is a continuing of violations in the reproductive side up to date. But also I wrote another article that is going to be published soon about how reproductive rights, they were deliberately excluded from the trials and from the Truth Commission. And I have another article that is also coming about how I'm working on this, but how also the tensions between international criminal law and international human rights law in terms of recognizing reproductive rights in a conflict. So I think this is a topic that we should pay more attention to it, because as I said, this is part of the rehabilitation of people, and it should be considered immediately rehabilitation. But the problem is that, as I said in the beginning, like violations against women, sometimes they're invisible, right? And these are not things that, unless you have a checkup, unless you have an ultrasound, etc., you don't know about this. And I think the international community should pay more attention to these kind of violations and the effects for the people, for the women in the long term, or even for men. You have also many cases how in Syria, and how they were targeting also their sexual organs and so on, right? There was this component. So we should also pay more attention to the psycho and medical side, help assistance for victims in this regard.
Wonderful. That's also incredibly important and powerful and sad work. And thank you for doing it, because it's definitely another issue very much worth fighting for and drawing attention to, because it's an angle that, yeah, it's not really explored, not using that umbrella, right? Sexual violence and conflict, yes, everyone talks about that, but reproductive rights, I think that's a whole other issue that we tend to miss. We tend to focus on one part of gender violence, and that's a whole other, yeah, in a way, much with many more tangible repercussions that we tend to miss. So thank you for calling attention to that gap and doing all that important work. And I look forward to reading those articles. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Dr. Noemi Pérez Vásquez, for telling us about this really important work you have been doing. And we look forward to reading your book. There should be a review of it coming out soon in the Australian Journal of Human Rights. Everyone stay tuned if you want yet another taster, but I do strongly recommend you go to the finest bookstore you have access to, and order this book today. It is a tremendous read, an important and powerful story. And thank you, Noemi, for telling it to us and bringing those the voices of those women to our attention. Thanks again, everyone, for joining this event of the Australian Human Rights Institute, and I hope to see you again soon for the next one.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lucas. Obrigada.